Have you ever reached the end of a day feeling as though you gave everything, and still somehow it wasn't enough? Have you ever knelt in prayer so exhausted that the only thing you could offer God was your inability to pray, and wondered quietly whether that counted at all? Have you ever looked at the life you wanted to live for Him, the devotion you intended, the faithfulness you promised yourself, and felt the quiet ache of a soul that tried and fell short again? There is a moment, and you know this moment, when the flame does not go out but it no longer rises. It burns close to the wax. It flickers when a door opens somewhere in the house. It gives almost no light at all. And yet it burns. And yet it has not stopped. This is not failure. This is not the end of devotion. This is exactly where Saint Thérèse of Lisieux, this woman of 24 years who entered eternity before most people have learned how to live, waited for you to arrive, because she lived here, in this precise place where the flame burns low. She did not rise above it on borrowed strength. She sat down in the wax and let God be the fire. She understood something so radical, so deeply counterintuitive, that the Church spent decades after her death slowly absorbing its fullness. That your fatigue, the real kind, the bone-deep kind, the kind that has nothing to do with laziness, is not a wound in your offering to God. It is the offering itself. Subscribe. Because if you are tired of trying to be enough for God, Thérèse has something to say to you that your heart has needed to hear for a very long time. Begin with this. Before the theology, before the quotes, before the centuries of scholarship built around this small woman from Normandy, begin with this simple image. A woman is sitting by a window. She is 22 years old. Her lungs are already being consumed. She has been told by her prioress that she must write her memories, her spiritual path, her interior life, and she does this at night, after the other sisters are asleep. By the light of a lamp, she is not supposed to keep burning so late. She is coughing when she writes. She spills ink sometimes. She falls asleep over the pages and wakes to find her candle nearly gone. And in those pages she writes words that will be read by popes and theologians, by mystics and by ordinary people, on ordinary evenings, who have never read a spiritual text in their lives, but who open this one and find themselves recognized down to the finest interior detail, as if she had somehow been watching them. What she wrote was not written in strength. It was written in what remained after strength had been used up. And this is exactly the point. We carry, most of us, a hidden assumption about holiness, one we did not consciously adopt but absorbed so deeply into the structure of our spiritual lives that we rarely examine it. The assumption is this, that what we offer God must come from our best. That prayer is most pleasing to Him when we arrive at it alert, focused, prepared. That service given from surplus is truer than service squeezed from the last of what we have. That devotion to count must feel like devotion, warm and willing, not grim and grinding. Thérèse spent her entire interior life, every conscious year of her religious life, dismantling this assumption, piece by piece, with surgical and merciful precision. She fell asleep during prayer. She said so. She wrote about it not with the tone of confession, but almost with the tone of a student, reporting something important to the teacher. I should be desolate for having slept, for 7 years, during my hours of mental prayer and my thanksgivings after Holy Communion, instead of reproaching myself. I think that children are just as dear to their parents when they are asleep as when they are wide awake. Read that again. Let it settle. She is not making excuses. She is not lowering the bar. She is doing something far more radical. She is relocating the site of holiness. It is not in the performance of attention. It is in the fact of being there, present, given, surrendered, even in sleep, before a Father who needs nothing from you in order to love you completely. This matters enormously for how you understand your tired days. When you arrive at prayer exhausted, when you sit down to read Scripture and your mind slides away before you've reached the end of the first verse, when you kneel and feel nothing, want nothing, bring nothing except your body folded into position, Thérèse is telling you something that sounds almost scandalous, that God receives this, that He does not sit in heaven calculating the quality of your attention and finding it insufficient. That the worn-out offering of a soul who showed up anyway, who chose to kneel in the dark instead of staying in bed, who whispered, "I'm here," and had nothing more to give, that this is not the least of offerings. It may be among the greatest. Because the greatest offerings are never the effortless ones, they are the ones that cost, not cost in the sense of performance, not the grinding moralism of someone who tortures themselves through devotion as a kind of spiritual endurance test. Thérèse had no patience for that kind of approach, and neither does the gospel, but cost in the simpler, truer sense, the thing given from scarcity rather than abundance, the widow's mite, the cup of cold water, the prayer whispered by a woman who has been awake all night with a sick child and kneels at dawn with nothing in her but the residue of love. Your tired efforts are not your offering. Your fatigue is the tiredness itself, the fact that you poured yourself out for the people and the duties and the griefs God placed in your life. This is what you bring to Him at the end of the day, not the remainder, the expenditure itself. And Thérèse knew this not because she read it in a book, but because she lived it in her body. She wanted to do more. She wanted to pray longer, love more ardently, serve more visibly. Her heart was large with desire, and her body was failing. And the distance between the two was not a spiritual problem to be solved. It was the very space where God was doing His most intimate work in her. She wrote, from that space, words that have accompanied millions of souls through their own spent seasons. Love proves itself by deeds, so how am I to show my love? Great deeds are forbidden me, but I want at least to multiply my small acts of love. Small acts, from small reserves, from the remnant of what's left. This is not settling for less than holiness. This is holiness, seen clearly, without the distortion of a spirituality that quietly worships human effort while speaking the language of grace. You were not called to be impressive before God. You were called to be His. There is a passage in her autobiography, the autobiography that began as a simple act of obedience to her prioress and ended as one of the most widely read spiritual texts in human history, where Thérèse describes a moment in a staircase. She is watching the older and stronger sisters climb the stairs to reach the upper floor. She is too ill. Her legs will not carry her up. She stands at the bottom and watches them go. And in this small domestic scene of physical limitation, she finds a theological image of absolute precision. She writes of finding an elevator. She does not mean a mechanical one, or rather, the mechanical one becomes the vehicle for something else entirely. She is speaking of the elevator of the arms of God. The way a very small child does not climb the stairs, cannot climb the stairs, but is lifted, carried, taken up without any exertion of the child's own. I wanted to find an elevator which would raise me to Jesus, for I am too small to climb the rough stairway of perfection. The elevator which must raise me to heaven is your arms, O Jesus. This is the little way. This is the whole of it, distilled to one image. But notice something that is easy to miss. The image begins in limitation. It begins in the fact that she cannot climb. The elevator is not a shortcut found by someone who was capable of the stairs and chose an easier route. It is the only possible path for someone who has already exhausted their capacity to ascend under their own power. This means that the little way, the way of spiritual childhood, of small acts, of complete abandonment, is not a path for the spiritually immature who haven't developed enough yet to attempt something more serious. It is the path for souls who have understood, fully and without resentment, that they are insufficient for the ascent. And this understanding, Thérèse insists, is not a defeat. It is the beginning of wisdom. It is, in fact, the condition God was waiting for. Think about what this means for you on a tired day. When you wake and you already feel behind, before the day has started, the fatigue of yesterday pressing into this morning like something unfinished, you carry an implicit spiritual narrative that whispers, today is already a compromised day. Your prayer will be second-rate. Your love will be thin. What you manage will be the reduced version of what you should have managed. Thérèse looks at that narrative, and she gently, firmly takes it out of your hands. She would ask you, who told you that God works from your surplus? Who told you that His arms open widest for the soul who arrives in strength? Scripture speaks of strength made perfect in weakness, not after weakness is overcome, but in it, within it, as its very substance. The vessel has to be empty for it to be filled. The hand has to be open for it to receive. Your exhaustion is not a compromise of the offering. Your exhaustion is the open hand. And here the doctrine of abandonment enters, this pillar of Thérèse's interior life, that she did not coin but lived with such completeness that it became inseparable from her name. Abandonment is not passivity. It is not resignation dressed in theological language. It is the active, chosen, daily surrender of the soul that says, I cannot carry this. I cannot ascend by these steps. I cannot produce from myself what is required of me today. And so I stop pretending otherwise. And so I hold out my arms to be lifted. This is not easy. Abandonment never is. We are so profoundly conditioned to equate our worth, spiritual worth, human worth, every kind of worth, with our output, that to genuinely release the machinery of effort and rest in the arms of God feels at first almost irresponsible. It feels like giving up. It feels like cheating. Thérèse knew this. She lived in a religious culture that prized visible asceticism, observable penance, the dramatics of spiritual striving. She was surrounded by sisters who fasted more visibly, prayed longer, showed their suffering more publicly. She could not compete. She did not try. She went, instead, in the opposite direction, not because she was lazy, but because she had understood something that the visible strivers had not yet grasped, that God is not impressed, that He does not need our performance, that what He desires from the soul is not its achievements, but its trust. And trust, real trust, looks remarkably like helplessness from the outside. It looks like the child who stops kicking against the arms that hold them and lets itself be carried. It looks, to the eye that values effort, like surrender. And it is, but surrender is not the opposite of love. Sometimes it is love's most complete expression. What are you gripping right now that God has been waiting for you to release? What effort have you been maintaining? White-knuckled, exhausted, convinced that if you stop it will all come undone, that He has been asking you quietly, for a long time, to lay down. The elevator is not a theological idea. It is a real structure, operating right now, in the space between your fatigue and His nearness. You do not have to climb. You only have to stop resisting being carried. There is something Thérèse did not write about until near the very end of her life. And when she did write about it, she wrote carefully. Not because she doubted what she had experienced, but because what she had experienced was so interior, so structurally different from the devotional warmth that had characterized the earlier years of her faith, that she was still finding the language for it. In the last 18 months of her life, as tuberculosis was consuming her, Thérèse entered what she described as a night of nothing. Not depression in the modern clinical sense, though the symptoms overlapped. Not a crisis of will, but a spiritual darkness, an absence of felt consolation, an inability to perceive the heaven she had believed in with such luminous certainty, a wall of darkness where the light had been. She wrote, I believe I have made more acts of faith in this past year than all through my whole life. She did not write it proudly. She wrote it with the precision of someone taking notes on a very difficult terrain. This is the dark night of faith, and it is enormously important for what we are talking about today, because the dark night is not a failure of devotion. It is, in many mystical traditions within Catholicism, in John of the Cross, whom Thérèse read, the deepest form of God's intimacy with the soul. It is what happens when God removes the feeling of His presence so that the soul discovers whether it will love Him without the feeling, whether it will trust without the warmth, whether it will kneel in the darkness and call it prayer. And Thérèse did, every day, for 18 months, coughing blood, unable to eat, lying in the infirmary while the darkness sat where the light used to be, and she offered her prayers, her masses, her rosaries, her small acts of love, from within a complete interior night. She told her sister Pauline toward the end, "If you only knew what darkness I am plunged into." And then she continued to love. This is the thing. This is the absolutely central thing that your tired days need to hear. The offering that costs the most is the offering made from within the dark, when you feel nothing, sense nothing, receive no warmth in return, and still show up. still pray, still serve, still love. Not because it feels holy. It does not feel holy. It feels like nothing. But feeling is not the measure. We have been trained, perhaps by the culture, perhaps by a devotional tradition that overprizes emotional experience in prayer, to read our interior states as accurate reports on the state of our soul. When prayer feels warm and alive, we conclude we are close to God. When prayer feels cold and mechanical, we conclude we have drifted. When devotion produces consolation, we trust it. When it produces nothing, we distrust ourselves. Thérèse and behind her, a deep river of Catholic mystical theology, is asking you to reconsider this entirely. The dark prayer, the prayer that costs you something because it produces nothing felt, is not empty prayer. It is not even ordinary prayer. It is, in the tradition she embodies, the prayer most purified of self-interest, because there is nothing in it for you. You are not praying to feel close to God. You are not praying to receive consolation. You are praying because you are His, and you have decided that this fact does not depend on warmth. This is the purity of intention that Thérèse lived with such consistency. She did not love God for what He gave her. She loved Him because He was God. She did not serve to be seen or to feel elevated, or even to feel good about herself. She served because love, real love, goes on when the feeling goes. Like a marriage that endures not because every day is warm, but because the covenant is deeper than the temperature of any given day. Your tired prayers, the ones you suspect don't count because you felt nothing when you said them. Thérèse would like to tell you something about those. She would tell you that God receives them with particular tenderness. That the prayer whispered in the dark, by a soul who is not even sure it is being heard but who kneels anyway. This prayer is not the weakest prayer. It is, in a very real sense, the purest one, because it is not contaminated by the desire for the feeling of holiness. It is just the soul in its bare reality before God, nothing performed, nothing managed, nothing offered except presence and persistence. The Holy Spirit works most quietly in this space, not dramatically. There are no consolations, no sudden warmth, no sense of breakthrough, but something is being built in the dark that could not be built in the light. A trust that has been tested, a love that has been stripped of everything accidental, a faith that knows God not by feeling but by choice. You are not failing God on the days you feel nothing. You may on those days be giving Him the fullest version of yourself, the self that has set aside the luxury of feeling and is simply, stubbornly, lovingly there. Let us come down from the heights of mystical theology, which is exactly what Thérèse would want, because she always came back down, and talk about a Tuesday. An ordinary Tuesday. Your Tuesday. The one where the alarm goes off and the first conscious thought is already a kind of heaviness. Where the tasks ahead are not dramatic or terrible, they are just many, and you are not rested, and there is no particular reason today should feel sacred or significant. Thérèse lived in a Carmelite convent in Lisieux, France, and contrary to a certain romantic image of cloistered religious life, her days were largely made up of exactly this: the ordinary, the repetitive, the unremarkable, laundry, prayer, more prayer, meals eaten in silence, duties assigned, completed, assigned again. The same sisters, the same rhythms, the same chapel, the same small tensions year after year. She was not transported by this. She was not always inspired. She wrote with disarming honesty about the sisters who irritated her, about the meals she found revolting, about the coldness of the chapel in winter that she was not allowed to remedy. She was a real person inside real circumstances that were often simply hard in the way ordinary things are hard. Not dramatically, not heroically, just persistently. And this is where she found her holiness, not in spite of the ordinariness, inside it. She developed what she called, and the Church has ratified as genuine and original, the little way. The way of small things, not the dramatic renunciation, not the grand gesture. The small act, done with great love in the middle of a Tuesday that nobody will remember and nobody will praise. She would pick up a pin from the floor, a literal pin, and offer it to God. Not as a penance, not as a spiritual exercise of the will, as an act of love. as a tiny flower placed in the hands of the beloved. She understood with a theological precision that she wore as lightly as an intuition that love does not require large objects. That the heart which brings a pin with full attention and genuine love is making a gift that heaven receives. This sounds, if you are not careful, like it is diminishing the spiritual life, like it is accommodating smallness, like Thérèse, frustrated by her limitations, simply reclassified small things as holy so that she could feel adequate. She was not doing that. She was doing something much harder. She was insisting that the kingdom of God is not a system of rewards for impressive performance. She was insisting, rooted in the gospel, in the Sermon on the Mount, in the parables of the lost sheep and the prodigal son and the laborers in the vineyard, that what God cares about is not the size of the act but the fullness of the love, and that fullness of love is possible in every act, regardless of how small, and impossible in no act, regardless of how large. This reframes your Tuesday entirely. The cup of coffee you make for someone without being asked, the patience you chose when the meeting ran long and your body wanted to leave, the phone call you made to someone lonely even though your own day had been hard, the moment when someone said something sharp and you absorbed it instead of returning it. These are not noble-sounding things. They are the texture of an ordinary Tuesday. And according to Thérèse, and according to the gospel she was reading so carefully, they are exactly where love lives. Your fatigue does not disqualify them. Your exhaustion does not diminish the gift. In fact, the act of love done from within fatigue carries something that the easy act does not. The evidence that you chose love when choosing love was costly. When you were rested and well-resourced, love came more naturally. When you were spent and thin-resourced, love required something more, and you gave it. That is not the lesser offering, that is the dearer one. Thérèse understood something about the theology of meritorious love that she would never have articulated in those terms. She was not a systematic theologian, but that sits at the heart of Catholic teaching on grace and cooperation. She understood that love's value before God is not indexed to its emotional warmth or its visible grandeur. It is indexed to its genuineness and its cost. The love that costs you something is the love that is most fully love, because love, at its root, is not a feeling. It is a choice. It is the act of the will that turns toward the good of another, regardless of the current state of the emotions. Your tired love is still love. Your spent devotion is still devotion. Your low-burning candle is still light. She would want you to go back to your Tuesday, to the ordinary texture of your hours, and to see it differently. Not to see it as the place where holiness is absent, waiting to be replaced by something more elevated, but to see it as the exact field where God has placed you to love Him, in the only way available to a creature, in the concrete, in the small, in the particular, in the tired, in the daily. And she would want you to know, this woman who died at 24, who never traveled beyond the walls of her convent after she entered them, who performed no visible miracle in her lifetime, who was buried in a plain wooden coffin, she would want you to know that the Church declared her a doctor of the Church, a teacher of the faith, not despite her smallness, because of it, because she proved that the little way works, that God hallows the fatigue, that He lifts what cannot climb, that He receives the worn-out offering with the same love with which He received the alabaster jar poured out entire at His feet, because He understands, better than anyone, that this is what love looks like when it is real. You are not failing. You are being faithfully spent, and He is receiving every last drop you stayed, through all of it, through the theology and the silence and the image of the candle burning low. You stayed. I want you to know that I notice that, because it tells me something about you. You are not someone who came here for entertainment. You came because something in you recognized this, the fatigue, the dark prayer, the Tuesday that nobody sees, the love that cost you more than it looked like from the outside. And that recognition means you are someone who takes the interior life seriously, someone who is trying to give God something real, not just something comfortable. There is a place I want to invite you. Our members receive something every single morning before the day begins, an exclusive daily morning prayer, written for you before you have done anything, before the list of tasks has found you, before the weight of the hours has settled. It is a prayer of covering, a prayer that places you deliberately and by name before heaven under the protection of God, and asks that you be carried through what is coming, not by your own strength, but by His. Every word of it is written with Thérèse as companion, her intercession woven through each line like a thread you may not always feel, but that holds, because she promised, she literally promised from her deathbed, that she would spend her heaven doing good on earth. This is your morning armor, not dramatic, not long, just true, and placed in your hands before the day has a chance to take anything from you. Come and be covered too.